When Margaret collapsed at the train station clutching a marriage contract, the stranger who carried her home discovered she'd been abandoned by the very man who was supposed to claim her as his bride. But as Daniel McKenna nursed her back to health in his lonely Nebraska cabin, neither of them realized that saving her would awaken something in both their hearts that could either heal their broken pasts or destroy their chance at happiness forever. Will Margaret choose the security of her legal contract when her intended finally arrives, or risk everything for a love that was never supposed to exist? The train's black smoke disappeared into the morning sky like a bad dream, leaving Margaret alone on the wooden platform with nothing but dust and broken promises. Her fingers hurt from holding the yellow papers so tight, but she couldn't let go of the marriage contract that was supposed to change her life. 3 days she had waited at this tiny train station in Nebraska territory. 3 whole days with barely any food and nowhere to sleep except the hard wooden bench. The station master kept looking at her with worried eyes, probably wondering why a young woman in a wrinkled dress kept staring down the empty railroad tracks like she was waiting for a miracle. Margaret's stomach made an angry noise. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and the little money in her cloth bag was almost gone. Back home in Pennsylvania, her father had made it sound so simple. "Reginald Blackwood is a good man with money," he had said while packing her trunk. "This marriage will solve all our problems." But where was this good man now? The contract in her hands had his signature next to hers, both names written in fancy black ink. It said he would meet her at Millbrook Station on the 15th day of September in the year 1867. Today was the 18th, and still no sign of him. The sun climbed higher, making the metal rails shine like silver snakes. Margaret felt dizzy and hot. Her blue dress, the nicest one she owned, was covered in dust from sitting on the platform for so long. She tried to smooth her brown hair, but it kept falling out of its pins. A little girl with pigtails skipped by with her mother, both carrying baskets of fresh bread. The smell made Margaret's mouth water and her stomach hurt even more. She watched them disappear into the general store across the dirt street, wishing she could follow them. "Maybe he's not coming," she whispered to herself, but saying it out loud made it feel too real. The marriage contract felt heavy in her hands, heavier than paper should feel. She unfolded it again and read the words she had read 100 times before. Her father's shaky handwriting was at the bottom, right next to Mr. Blackwood's neat signature. 2 men had decided her future without even asking what she wanted. Margaret tried to stand up, but her legs felt like jelly. The world started spinning around her like a toy top. She grabbed the wooden post next to the bench, but her hands were too sweaty to hold on tight. "Not now," she said to the empty air. "Please, not now." But her body wouldn't listen. The train station started to look fuzzy, like she was seeing it through thick glass. The sound of horses and wagon wheels became far away, like someone had stuffed cotton in her ears. Margaret took 1 step toward the station door, then another. Her feet felt like they were made of lead. The marriage contract slipped from her fingers and fluttered toward the ground, but she caught it just in time. This piece of paper was all she had left of her old life, even if it was just a lie. The wooden platform seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret put her hand against the wall to steady herself, but the rough boards felt like they were moving. Her heart was beating so fast it hurt, and little black spots danced in front of her eyes. She could hear footsteps coming closer, but they sounded like they were coming from underwater. Someone was walking across the platform, their boots making a steady rhythm against the wood. Margaret wanted to call out for help, but her voice had disappeared. The footsteps stopped right in front of her. Margaret looked up and saw a pair of brown leather boots, scuffed and worn from hard work. Above the boots were dark pants and strong hands that looked like they had built things and fixed things and worked in the sun. "Miss," the voice was deep and gentle, like warm honey. "Are you all right?" Margaret tried to answer, but no words came out. The black spots in front of her eyes were getting bigger, and the world was fading away like a candle being blown out. The last thing she remembered was falling forward, and those gentle hands catching her before she hit the ground. Margaret woke up floating through the air, but that couldn't be right. She blinked her eyes and realized she was being carried by someone strong and careful. The man holding her had gray hair that touched his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. "Put me down," she tried to say, but her voice came out like a whisper. "I can walk." The man looked down at her with those gray eyes, and Margaret saw something kind in them. "Can you?" he asked, not in a mean way, but like he really wanted to know. Margaret tried to make her legs work, but they felt like cooked noodles. The man holding her was tall and lean, with strong shoulders that carried her weight like she was no heavier than a feather. His shirt was clean but patched in places, and his hands were rough from working outside. "My name is Daniel McKenna," he said as they walked toward a small wooden house. "And you're going to be fine." The house sat by itself on the flat Nebraska land, with a small garden and a barn behind it. It looked lonely but clean, like someone took care of it, even though they lived there alone. Smoke was coming from the chimney, and Margaret could smell bread baking inside. "The paper," Margaret said suddenly, trying to sit up in his arms. "Where's my paper?" Daniel nodded toward his shirt pocket. "I picked it up when you fell. Looked important." Margaret felt her face get hot with shame. A stranger had to pick up her business from the ground because she was too weak to hold on to it. "It's not important," she said, looking away from his face. "Not anymore." Daniel carried her up the wooden steps to his front door. The porch was small but neat, with a chair for sitting and a water bucket for washing. Everything looked like it had been built by someone who cared about doing things right. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. There was a fireplace with a warm fire crackling, and shelves made from old boards held books and dishes. A quilt covered the bed near the window, and dried flowers hung from the wooden ceiling. Daniel set her down gently on the bed, then went to the stove where a kettle was already heating. Margaret watched him move around the kitchen, noticing how he did everything with quiet, careful movements. He poured hot water into a cup and added leaves that smelled like flowers. "Drink this," he said, handing her the cup. "It'll help." Margaret took the cup with shaking hands. The tea was hot and sweet, and it made her empty stomach feel better. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Daniel sat down in a chair across from her, but not too close. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "You don't know anything about me. I could be a criminal or a crazy person." Daniel almost smiled. "Are you?" "No," Margaret said, feeling silly. "Then there's no problem." Margaret looked around the small house again. Everything was clean and organized, but she noticed there were 2 plates on the shelf and 2 cups by the sink. "Do you live alone?" she asked. Daniel's face changed, becoming sadder. "I do now." Margaret saw a picture on the shelf above the fireplace. It showed a pretty woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Next to it was a smaller picture of a little boy with curly hair. "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. Daniel followed her eyes to the pictures. "That's Emily, my wife, and our son James. They died 2 winters ago when the sickness came through." Margaret felt her heart hurt for this kind man who had lost everything. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you." Daniel got up and went back to the stove. "Are you hungry? I have soup cooking." Margaret's stomach answered for her with a loud growl, making her face turn red again. Daniel ladled soup into a bowl and brought it to her. It smelled like vegetables and herbs, and when she tasted it, it was the best food she had eaten in days. "This is wonderful," she said between spoonfuls. "Emily taught me to cook," Daniel said. "She said a man should know how to take care of himself." Margaret ate the soup slowly, enjoying every bite. Outside, the wind was picking up, and she could hear it whistling around the house. Dark clouds were gathering in the sky, and the air smelled like rain. "There's a storm coming," Daniel said, looking out the window. "Good thing we got you inside." Margaret set down her empty bowl. "I should go. I've already caused you enough trouble." "Where would you go?" Daniel asked gently. Margaret realized she had nowhere to go. No money for a hotel, no family to help her, and no husband coming to get her. She was completely alone in a place she had never been before. "I don't know," she whispered, and for the first time since the train left without her, she started to cry. Daniel handed her a clean cloth for her tears. "You can stay here as long as you need to. No questions, no payment required." Margaret looked at this stranger who was being kinder to her than anyone had been in years. But why would you do that for someone you don't even know? Thunder crashed outside like giant fists pounding on the roof, and Margaret jumped so hard she nearly spilled her tea. Daniel moved quickly to close the wooden shutters as rain began hammering against the windows like angry bullets. Sometimes these prairie storms hit fast, Daniel said, lighting an oil lamp as the room grew darker. We'll be safe inside, but it might last all night. Margaret pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. The cozy cabin felt even smaller now, with the storm raging outside and nowhere else to go. She watched Daniel check the fire and add more wood, his movements calm and sure despite the chaos outside. Tell me about the marriage contract, Daniel said gently, settling back into his chair. If you want to. Margaret's fingers found the crumpled paper in her dress pocket. My father owes money to some bad men. A lot of money, he said, marrying Mr. Marring. Blackwood would solve everything. She smoothed the paper on her lap. But I've never even met him. We just wrote letters back and forth. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the shutters, making scary shadows dance on the walls. What did he say in his letters? Daniel asked. He wrote about his business and his big house. He said I would have nice dresses and servants to help me. Margaret's voice got quieter. But he never asked what I liked or what I wanted to do with my life. Daniel poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks flying up the chimney. What do you want to do? Nobody had ever asked Margaret that question before. She thought about it while the storm raged outside. I like to read books and teach children. Back home, I helped at the church school sometimes. The little ones would gather around when I read stories, and their eyes would get so big and excited. That sounds wonderful, Daniel said, and Margaret could tell he really meant it. My father said those were just silly dreams. He said a woman's job was to get married and have babies and keep house. Margaret felt tears starting again. But what if I'm not good at being a wife? What if I don't know how to make a man happy? Daniel leaned forward in his chair. Margaret, the right man won't need you to make him happy. He'll be happy just because you're you. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse. Wind howled around the cabin like wild animals, and Margaret could hear tree branches scraping against the roof. She was grateful to be inside somewhere safe and warm. Were you happy with Emily? Margaret asked. Daniel's face softened when he looked at his wife's picture. Every single day, even when things were hard, even when we didn't have much money. She used to sing while she cooked, and she'd make up silly songs about whatever she was making. He smiled at the memory. She taught me that happiness isn't something you find. It's something you build together. Margaret felt a strange fluttering in her chest. Daniel talked about love like it was something real and possible, not just a business deal between families. How did you meet her? I was teaching at a school in Boston. She came to a church social with her sister, and I was too shy to ask her to dance. Daniel chuckled. She finally had to ask me. Said she wasn't going to wait all night for me to find my courage. She sounds brave, Margaret said. She was. When we decided to come west, everyone said we were crazy. But Emily said adventures were better when you had someone to share them with. Daniel's voice got sad again. I just wish we'd had more time. Another crack of thunder made Margaret jump again. The storm was right overhead now, and she could hear rain pouring off the roof in waterfalls. I'm scared, she admitted. Of the storm? Of everything. Of being alone. Of not knowing what to do next. Of making the wrong choice. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. What if my father was right? What if I'm just being foolish and childish? Daniel got up and went to one of his bookshelves. He pulled out a worn leather book and brought it back to his chair. Emily used to read this when she was worried about the future, he said, opening it carefully. It's a book of poems. She said they reminded her that other people had faced hard times and found their way through. He cleared his throat and began to read in his warm, gentle voice. The words were beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once. Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in days, listening to the rhythm of his voice, mixing with the sound of rain on the roof. That's beautiful, she said when he finished. Emily always said that storms pass, but the things that matter last forever. Daniel closed the book carefully. Maybe this storm in your life will pass too. Margaret looked around the small cabin that had become her refuge. The fire crackled warmly, the lamp cast golden light on the simple furniture, and Daniel sat across from her like a guardian angel who had appeared just when she needed him most. "Daniel," she said softly, "why did you really help me today?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because I know what it feels like to be lost and alone. When Emily and James died, I thought about giving up, just walking into the prairie and never coming back." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "But then I realized that helping someone else might be the only way to help myself." Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows like liquid gold, and Margaret woke to the most amazing smell she had ever experienced. Daniel was already up, standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, flipping pancakes in a black iron pan. "Good morning," he said with a smile that made her heart do a little skip. "I hope you're hungry." Margaret sat up in bed, suddenly aware that her hair was a mess and her dress was wrinkled from sleeping in it. "I must look terrible," she said, trying to smooth her hair. "You look like someone who survived a storm," Daniel said, setting a plate of golden pancakes on the table. "And that's something to be proud of." The pancakes were light and fluffy, with butter melting on top and honey drizzled over everything. Margaret ate like she hadn't seen food in weeks, which wasn't far from the truth. Daniel watched her eat with a satisfied expression, like feeding her made him happy. "These are incredible," Margaret said between bites. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother back in Boston. She said any man who couldn't feed himself wasn't really a man at all." Daniel poured coffee from a pot that smelled like heaven. "Emily improved my skills quite a bit when we got married." Margaret looked around the cabin in the morning light. Everything was neat and organized, but she could see little touches that must have been Emily's. A dried flower arrangement on the windowsill, a colorful quilt folded on the chair, a small wooden box with a carved heart on the mantel. "Do you miss Boston?" Margaret asked. Daniel considered this while he ate his own pancakes. "Sometimes. I miss the libraries and the other teachers, but Emily loved it here. She said the big sky made her feel free, like she could do anything." He gestured toward the window. She was right. "There's something about this place that makes you believe in new possibilities." After breakfast, Daniel showed Margaret around his small farm. The storm had left everything clean and fresh, with puddles reflecting the blue sky and birds singing in the trees. He had a vegetable garden behind the house, with rows of corn and beans and squash growing in neat lines. "Emily planned this garden," Daniel said, kneeling to pull weeds from around the tomato plants. "She said we needed to be able to feed ourselves if we were going to make it out here." Margaret watched him work, noticing how gently he handled the plants. His hands were strong but careful, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to have those hands hold hers. "Can I help?" she asked. Daniel looked surprised. "You don't have to do that. You're a guest." "I want to help. I need to do something useful." Margaret knelt beside him in the dirt. "Besides, I like working with plants. We had a garden back home." They worked together in comfortable silence, pulling weeds and checking the vegetables. Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't felt in years. The work was simple and honest, and Daniel's presence beside her felt natural and right. "Margaret," Daniel said suddenly, "what was your life like before? Really like?" Margaret sat back on her heels, thinking about how to explain. "Quiet, lonely. My mother died when I was 12, and after that it was just me and my father. He worked all the time, and when he was home, he was usually drinking." She pulled another weed. "I spent most of my time reading or helping at the church. I didn't have many friends." "What about the marriage arrangement? How did that happen?" Margaret's face grew hot with shame. "My father met Mr. Blackwood at a card game. They got to talking, and my father mentioned he had a daughter who needed a husband. Mr. Blackwood said he needed a wife to run his household." She threw the weed she was holding into the pile. "They worked out the details like I was a horse they were trading." Daniel stopped weeding and looked at her. "That must have been frightening." "It was, but I thought maybe it would be better than staying home. At least I'd have a purpose, a place where I belonged." Margaret felt tears starting again. "But then he didn't come, and I realized I was just fooling myself. I don't belong anywhere." Daniel reached over and gently took her hand. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from work, but his touch was the kindest thing Margaret had ever felt. "You belong wherever you choose to be," he said softly. "And right now, you belong here." They went back to weeding, but now Margaret was very aware of Daniel working beside her. She noticed how his gray hair caught the sunlight, how his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, how he hummed quietly while he worked. "Daniel," she said after a while, "do you ever think about getting married again?" His hands stilled on the plants. "Sometimes, but it would have to be someone very special, someone who could understand that Emily will always be part of who I am." "That makes sense," Margaret said, though she felt a little stab of something that might have been jealousy. "What about you? Do you think you'll try to find another husband?" Margaret considered this while she worked. "I don't know. After what happened with Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure I trust my judgment about men." She glanced at Daniel. "Present company excluded, of course." Daniel smiled at that. "Of course." They finished the weeding and moved to the chicken coop, where Daniel had 6 red hens that clucked and fussed when they saw strangers. Margaret had never been around chickens before, and she was a little nervous when Daniel handed her a basket for collecting eggs. "They won't hurt you," he said with a grin. "Just reach under them gently and take the eggs. They're used to it." Margaret approached the first hen nervously. The bird eyed her suspiciously but let her take the egg from underneath. "I did it," Margaret said, feeling ridiculously proud. "You're a natural," Daniel said, and Margaret glowed at his praise. As they walked back to the house with their basket of eggs, Margaret realized something had changed. For the first time in her life, she felt useful and appreciated. Daniel didn't treat her like a burden or a problem to be solved. He treated her like a person who mattered. But even as she enjoyed this feeling, a worry nagged at the back of her mind. What would happen when Mr. Blackwood finally showed up? And what would happen to her heart, which was already starting to feel things for Daniel that she had no right to feel? The sound of horses galloping fast made Daniel drop his coffee cup, and it shattered on the wooden floor like a gunshot. Margaret froze at the kitchen table, her fork halfway to her mouth, as the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder and closer. "Stay inside," Daniel said, moving quickly to the window. His whole body had gone tense, like a cat ready to fight. 3 riders coming in hard. That's never good news." Margaret's heart started beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Through the gap in the curtains, she saw dust clouds rising from the dirt road that led to Daniel's farm. The riders were still too far away to see clearly, but they were coming straight toward the cabin. "What if it's him?" Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. "What if it's Mr. Blackwood?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with it." He reached above the fireplace and took down a rifle that Margaret hadn't noticed before. "But nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." The horses were close enough now that Margaret could hear the jingle of bridles and the creak of leather saddles. Daniel checked his rifle carefully, then set it beside the door where he could reach it quickly. His movements were calm and sure, but Margaret could see the worry in his gray eyes. "Margaret," he said softly, "whatever happens, remember that you have choices. You're not a piece of property to be bought and sold." The hoofbeats stopped right outside the cabin. Margaret heard men's voices, low and serious, talking among themselves. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to keep them still. A loud knock echoed through the cabin, making Margaret jump. "Open up," a man's voice called out. "I know she's in there." Daniel looked at Margaret, and she nodded, trying to be brave. He opened the door just wide enough to step outside, keeping his body between the visitors and the cabin. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Daniel's voice was polite but firm. "You can start by sending out my bride," came the reply. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice from her nightmares. It was Reginald Blackwood, and he sounded angry. Margaret crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. Mr. Blackwood sat on a beautiful black horse, wearing an expensive suit and a hat that probably cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and cold blue eyes that reminded her of winter ice. Behind him were 2 other men on horses. They looked rough and mean, like the kind of men her father owed money to. One had a scar across his cheek, and the other kept his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Your bride?" Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I think there's been some confusion." Blackwood laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. No confusion at all. Margaret Hartwell was supposed to meet me at the train station. When she didn't show up, I tracked her here. His eyes narrowed. "Now send her out so we can get this marriage business finished." "She was at the station," Daniel said, "for 3 days. Where were you?" "Business delayed me, but the contract is still valid, and she's still my intended bride." Blackwood's voice grew harder. "I don't appreciate having to chase down my property." Margaret felt anger flare up inside her chest like a fire. Property? She was a person, not a thing to be owned. She stood up from the table, her fear replaced by fury. "I'm not your property," she called out through the door, "and I'm not going anywhere with you." Blackwood's face turned red. "You signed a contract. Your father signed a contract. You can't just decide to break it because your feelings got hurt." Margaret stepped outside, ignoring Daniel's worried look. Seeing Blackwood up close made her even angrier. He sat on his horse like a king, looking down at peasants, his mouth twisted in an ugly sneer. "I waited for you," Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage. 3 days I sat on that platform with nowhere to go and no word from you. If I meant so little that your business was more important, then we're not meant to be married. Marriage isn't about feelings, you silly girl. Blackwood snapped. It's about contracts and agreements and practical arrangements. I can give you a fine house and nice clothes and a respectable position in society. What about love? Margaret asked. What about kindness and respect? Blackwood laughed again, and it made Margaret's skin crawl. Love? You've been reading too many romantic novels. Marriage is a business arrangement. Nothing more. Daniel stepped closer to Margaret, and she could feel his solid presence beside her like a shield. Maybe that's how you see marriage, Daniel said quietly, but some of us believe it should be built on more than money and contracts. The scarred man behind Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle. We doing this the easy way or the hard way, boss? Blackwood studied Daniel with those cold blue eyes. You're making a mistake, farmer. I have friends in town, important friends. I can make life very difficult for people who interfere with my business. And I have friends too, Daniel replied calmly. Good people who believe in doing what's right. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward Daniel. He was risking his safety to protect her, even though he barely knew her. No one had ever stood up for her before. The contract is binding, Blackwood continued. If Margaret refuses to honor it, I can take her to court. I can ruin her reputation and her family's name. Then do it, Margaret said, surprising everyone, including herself. I'd rather face scandal than marry someone who thinks I'm just property to be collected. Blackwood's eyes went wide with shock. He clearly hadn't expected her to call his bluff. You don't mean that? I absolutely mean it. Margaret lifted her chin higher. I've learned something these past few days. I've learned what it feels like to be treated with kindness and respect. I won't settle for less. The man with his hand on his gun shifted restlessly. Boss, we could just take her. Who's going to stop us? Daniel's hand moved slowly toward his rifle. I am. The tension in the yard crackled like lightning about to strike, and Margaret could barely breathe as she watched the 3 men on horses stare down at Daniel. The scarred man's hand was now resting openly on his gun, and Blackwood's face had turned an ugly shade of purple. You're willing to die for a woman you barely know? Blackwood asked Daniel with disbelief. I'm willing to die for what's right, Daniel replied, his voice steady as stone. And forcing a woman into marriage against her will isn't right. Margaret felt her heart swell with something powerful and warm. Nobody had ever been willing to fight for her before. Her own father had sold her off without a second thought, but this kind man was ready to risk everything to protect her freedom. This is ridiculous, Blackwood sputtered. Margaret, stop this nonsense right now. You're my intended bride, and you're coming with me. No, Margaret said firmly. I'm not. She moved closer to Daniel, and he shifted slightly so his body was protecting hers. The movement was small, but it said everything about how he saw her, not as property, but as someone worth protecting. The man with the gun started to draw his weapon, but suddenly the sound of more horses filled the air. Margaret turned to see 5 riders approaching fast from town, led by a man wearing a silver star on his chest. "Sheriff Morrison," Daniel called out with relief. The sheriff rode up and took in the scene with sharp eyes. He was an older man with gray whiskers and hands that looked like they'd handled plenty of trouble. "What's going on here, Daniel?" "These men are trying to force Miss Hartwell to leave against her will," Daniel explained. Sheriff Morrison looked at Blackwood and his companions with obvious suspicion. "That true?" "She's under contract to marry me," Blackwood said, trying to sound important. "This man is interfering with legal business." "Let me see this contract," the sheriff said, holding out his hand. Margaret pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket and handed it to the sheriff. He read it carefully, while everyone waited in tense silence. The horses stamped their feet and snorted, and somewhere in the distance a crow cawed. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "this contract says you were supposed to meet her at the train station on September 15th. That was 5 days ago. Where were you?" "Business delayed me," Blackwood said impatiently. "But the contract is still valid." "Actually, it's not." The sheriff folded the paper and handed it back to Margaret. "See, a contract requires both parties to fulfill their obligations. When you failed to show up at the agreed time and place, you broke the contract first." Margaret felt a rush of relief so strong it made her dizzy. "So I'm free?" "Free as a bird," the sheriff confirmed with a smile. "This piece of paper isn't worth the ink it's written with." Blackwood's face went from purple to bright red. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "I can, and I am," the sheriff interrupted. "Now, I suggest you and your friends ride back to town before I decide to look closer at those guns you're carrying." The scarred man looked like he wanted to argue, but the sheriff's deputies had their hands resting on their own weapons. After a long moment, Blackwood jerked his horse's reins around. "This isn't over," he snarled at Margaret. "I have influence in this territory. I can make sure no decent man will ever marry you." "Good," Margaret said with more courage than she felt. "I'd rather be alone than married to someone who doesn't see my worth." Blackwood and his men rode away in a cloud of dust and anger, but Margaret barely noticed. She was too busy staring at Daniel, who was looking at her with something that might have been admiration. "That was incredibly brave," he said softly. "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." The sheriff tipped his hat to both of them. "If those men give you any more trouble, you send word to town. We'll handle it." After the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Margaret and Daniel stood alone in the sudden quiet. The morning sun was climbing higher, warming the air and making everything look peaceful again. "I can't believe it's over," Margaret said, looking down at the marriage contract in her hands. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked. Margaret looked around at the little farm that had become her sanctuary. The neat garden, the cozy cabin, the chickens clucking contentedly in their coop. Most of all, she looked at Daniel, whose kindness had given her the strength to stand up for herself. "I don't know," she said honestly. "For the first time in my life, I get to choose my own future. It's exciting and terrifying at the same time." Daniel was quiet for a moment, like he was working up courage to say something important. "Margaret, I know we haven't known each other very long, but these past few days have been—" He paused, searching for the right words. "They've been the best days I've had since Emily died." Margaret's heart started beating faster. "They've been wonderful for me, too." "I know I'm not much to offer," Daniel continued, his voice uncertain. "Just a small farm and a simple life. But if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to help me build something here," he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, "I think we could be happy together." Margaret felt tears starting, but these were good tears, happy tears. "Daniel, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it. Not because of any contract or agreement between other people, but because we choose each other." Margaret looked at this wonderful man who had saved her in every way that mattered. He had shown her what real kindness looked like, what it meant to be valued and protected and cared for. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would love to stay and build a life with you." Daniel's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms right there in the yard. Margaret had never felt so safe and happy and free in her entire life. As they held each other in the morning sunshine, Margaret realized that sometimes the worst things that happen to you can lead to the best things. If Blackwood had shown up at the station on time, she never would have met Daniel. She never would have learned that she was strong enough to stand up for herself, or that love could be built on kindness instead of contracts. The future stretched out before them like an open prairie, full of possibilities and promise. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to button the blue dress she had worn on the train, but her fingers wouldn't work right because today was her wedding day, and everything felt like a beautiful dream that might disappear. 3 weeks had passed since Daniel proposed, and now the little church in town was filled with people she was just getting to know. "Hold still, dear," said Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, as she helped with the stubborn buttons. "You're as nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm." Through the small window of the church's back room, Margaret could see Daniel waiting at the altar in his best suit. He had combed his gray hair neatly and shaved carefully, but she could tell he was nervous too by the way he kept adjusting his tie. "What if I'm making a mistake?" Margaret whispered to Mrs. Patterson. "What if I don't know how to be a good wife?" Mrs. Patterson smiled kindly. "Child, I've been watching you and Daniel together for 3 weeks. The way he looks at you and the way you look at him, that's not a mistake. That's a blessing." Margaret peeked out the window again. The church was fuller than she had expected. Sheriff Morrison sat in the front row with his wife, along with the doctor and his family. Even some of the farmers from nearby had come with their wives and children. These people barely knew her, but they had come to celebrate her happiness. "Why are all these people here?" Margaret asked, surprised by how welcome she felt. "Because Daniel is a good man who's been alone too long, Mrs. Patterson explained while fixing Margaret's hair. "And because this community takes care of its own, you're one of us now." The words made Margaret's heart feel warm and full. Back in Pennsylvania, she had never felt like she belonged anywhere. But here in this little Nebraska town, people had opened their hearts to her just because Daniel cared about her. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Margaret?" came Daniel's voice from outside. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Mrs. Patterson opened the door just wide enough for Daniel to slip inside. When he saw Margaret in her wedding dress, his face lit up like sunrise. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "So do you," Margaret replied, and meant it. Daniel looked handsome and strong and kind, everything she had never dared to hope for in a husband. "I wanted to give you something," Daniel said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "It was my mother's." Inside the box was a simple gold ring with a tiny blue stone that caught the light like a piece of captured sky. "Oh, Daniel, it's lovely. She would have wanted you to have it," Daniel said, taking her hand gently. "Margaret, I need you to know something. If you change your mind, if you want to leave, I'll understand. I won't try to stop you." Margaret looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw the fear there. He was afraid she would run away, afraid this happiness was too good to last. She squeezed his hand tighter. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "I choose you, Daniel McKenna. I choose this life we're going to build together." The relief on his face was so clear that Margaret almost cried. They had both been hurt before, both learned not to trust too easily, but somehow they had found each other and decided to be brave together. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked. "More than ready," Margaret replied. They walked into the main part of the church together, and Margaret was amazed by what she saw. Someone had decorated the simple wooden pews with wildflowers and ribbons. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything look golden and magical. Reverend Patterson stood at the front wearing his best black suit and holding his worn Bible. He smiled warmly at both of them as they approached. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Daniel McKenna and Margaret Hartwell." As the familiar words washed over her, Margaret felt a peace she had never known before. This wasn't a business arrangement made by other people. This was her choice, freely given to a man who valued her for exactly who she was. "Daniel," the Reverend said, "do you take Margaret to be your wife, to love and cherish her in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Daniel said, his voice strong and sure. "Margaret, do you take Daniel to be your husband, to love and cherish him, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live. Margaret looked at Daniel's kind face and thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The broken contract, the collapse at the train station, the stranger who had carried her to safety. All of it had led to this perfect moment. "I do," she said clearly. When Daniel slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, Margaret felt like she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. Not someone's unwanted daughter or purchased bride, but Daniel's chosen wife and partner. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Patterson announced with a big smile. Daniel's kiss was gentle and sweet, and Margaret heard the congregation cheer behind them. When they turned to face their friends, everyone was smiling and clapping, and Margaret felt overwhelmed by so much joy and acceptance. The celebration dinner in the church basement was the most wonderful party Margaret had ever attended, with tables covered in white cloths and more food than she had ever seen in one place. The church ladies had outdone themselves with fried chicken, fresh bread, vegetable casseroles, and 3 different kinds of pie. "Mrs. McKenna," said Dr. Anderson, raising his glass of apple cider, "welcome to our community. We're lucky to have you." Margaret blushed at being called Mrs. McKenna. It would take some getting used to, but she loved how it sounded. She was no longer Margaret Hartwell, the unwanted daughter with a broken marriage contract. She was Margaret McKenna, Daniel's wife, and a respected member of this warm community. "Thank you all so much," Margaret said, standing up beside Daniel. 3 weeks ago, I thought my life was over. I felt lost and alone and worthless. But you've all shown me such kindness, and Daniel has shown me what real love looks like." The women in the room dabbed at their eyes with their handkerchiefs, and Margaret saw several of the men nodding approvingly. These good people understood about second chances and new beginnings. "To Daniel and Margaret," called out Sheriff Morrison, "may you have many happy years together." Everyone raised their glasses and echoed the toast, and Margaret felt so much love surrounding her that she thought her heart might burst with happiness. As the evening wound down, people began saying their goodbyes and heading home to their own families. The church ladies insisted on packing up leftover food for Daniel and Margaret to take home, saying that newlyweds shouldn't have to worry about cooking for at least a week. "You take care of our Daniel," Mrs. Morrison whispered to Margaret as she hugged her goodbye. "He's been sad for too long." "I will," Margaret promised, "and he'll take care of me too." Finally, it was time to go home. Daniel helped Margaret into their wagon, which someone had decorated with ribbons and tin cans that clanked merrily as they drove through town. People waved from their porches and called out congratulations, making Margaret feel like a princess in a fairy tale. The ride back to the farm was quiet and peaceful. The sun was setting, painting the prairie sky in shades of pink and gold. Margaret sat close to Daniel on the wagon seat, her hand resting on his arm, both of them content to enjoy the silence after such a busy, happy day. "Did you ever imagine this?" Margaret asked as they turned down the path to their cabin. "When you woke up this morning, did you think you'd end the day as a married man?" Daniel chuckled. "To be honest, I've been thinking about it for weeks, ever since that first morning when I watched you work in the garden. You looked so natural there, so right, like you belonged." "I felt like I belonged too," Margaret admitted. "For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." They reached the cabin, and Daniel helped Margaret down from the wagon. In the fading light, their little home looked cozy and welcoming, with smoke curling from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows. "Welcome home, Mrs. McKenna," Daniel said softly. Margaret smiled at the words, home. She had never really had a home before, just places where she lived. But this little cabin with its neat garden and gentleman was truly home. Inside, someone had been busy while they were at the wedding celebration. Fresh flowers filled vases on the table and windowsills. The floors had been swept clean, and the bed was made up with fresh linens and covered with flower petals. "The church ladies," Daniel explained when he saw Margaret's surprised expression. "They insisted on preparing everything while we were at dinner." Margaret walked around the cabin, touching the flowers and straightening things that didn't need straightening. She was nervous, and Daniel seemed to understand. "Margaret," he said gently, "we don't have to do anything you're not ready for. We can take this as slowly as you need." His kindness made Margaret love him even more. Another man might have demanded his rights as a husband, but Daniel was thinking about her comfort and feelings. "I know," she said, turning to face him. "I trust you, Daniel. I trust you completely." They sat together on the small sofa by the fireplace, Margaret's head resting on Daniel's shoulder while he stroked her hair. The fire crackled peacefully, and outside they could hear the familiar sounds of their farm, chickens settling for the night, the wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle. "What do you think Emily would say about all this?" Margaret asked quietly. Daniel was silent for a moment, thinking, "I think she'd be happy. She always said I was meant to take care of people, and that I'd wither up and die if I stayed alone too long." He pressed a kiss to the top of Margaret's head. "She'd like you. You're both strong women who know your own minds." "I hope I can live up to her memory," Margaret said. "You're not replacing her," Daniel said firmly. "You're starting something new with me. Emily was my past, and a beautiful one, but you're my future, and that's just as beautiful." Margaret felt tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. She had found something she never knew existed, a love that didn't demand she be someone different, but celebrated exactly who she was. "I love you, Daniel McKenna," she whispered. "I love you too, Margaret McKenna," he replied. As they sat together in their little home, surrounded by the peace and quiet of the Nebraska prairie, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them together. The abandoned marriage contract that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something wonderful. Tomorrow they would start their new life together as husband and wife. They would work the farm, maybe start that school Daniel had mentioned, and build something beautiful together. But tonight, they were just two people who had found each other against all odds, grateful for second chances, and brave enough to choose love. A letter with official government seals arrived on a cold October morning that changed everything, and Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words that could destroy their happiness. The postman had ridden out specially from town, saying it looked too important to wait for Daniel's usual weekly trip to collect mail. "What is it?" Daniel asked, seeing her face go pale as fresh snow. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, the letter fluttering in her shaking fingers. "It's from the territorial court in Omaha. Mr. Blackwood is suing us. He's claiming that our marriage isn't legal because I was already bound to him by contract." Daniel took the letter and read it twice, his jaw getting tighter with each word. "This is ridiculous. The sheriff said that contract was worthless when Blackwood failed to show up. But look at this part." Margaret pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. "Blackwood has 3 witnesses who say they saw him at the train station on the right day. They're claiming he was there and I ran away with you instead of meeting him." The lies were so bold and shocking that Margaret felt sick to her stomach. How could anyone make up such terrible stories? Daniel set the letter down and began pacing around their small kitchen like a caged animal. "Those men with him that day," Daniel said grimly. "They'll say whatever he pays them to say." Margaret felt tears starting to burn behind her eyes. After 6 weeks of perfect happiness, the outside world was trying to tear them apart again. "Daniel, what if the judge believes them? What if they say our marriage has to be canceled?" "That's not going to happen," Daniel said firmly, but Margaret could hear the worry in his voice. The letter said they had to appear in court in 3 weeks, and until then, Margaret wasn't allowed to leave the county. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, even though it was the place she loved most in the world. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly, looking at the last page of the legal papers. "Blackwood is also suing for damages. He says I cost him money and hurt his reputation by running away." Daniel stopped pacing and stared at her. "How much money?" $500. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. That was more money than most people saw in 2 years, certainly more than a small farmer like Daniel could ever pay. For the first time since she'd known him, Daniel looked truly defeated. He sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. "I don't have that kind of money, Margaret. If we lose this case—" "We won't lose," Margaret said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "We have the truth on our side." "Sometimes the truth isn't enough," Daniel replied sadly. "Blackwood has money and influence. He can afford fancy lawyers and paid witnesses. What do we have?" Before Margaret could answer, they heard horses approaching the cabin again. Both of them tensed, remembering the last time unexpected visitors had arrived. But when Margaret looked out the window, she saw Sheriff Morrison riding up alone. "Morning, folks," the sheriff said when Daniel opened the door. "I heard about the legal trouble. Thought I might be able to help." They invited the sheriff inside and offered him coffee while he read through the court papers. He shook his head in disgust as he finished. "This is a load of horse manure," Sheriff Morrison said bluntly. "I was there that day when Blackwood showed up. He never mentioned being at the station before, and those men with him looked like hired thugs, not respectable witnesses." "Can you testify for us?" Margaret asked hopefully. "Absolutely. And I'm not the only one." The sheriff pulled out a small notebook. "I've been asking around town about Blackwood. Turns out he has a reputation for this kind of thing. There's a woman in Kansas who says he tried the same trick with her sister 2 years ago." Margaret felt her first spark of hope since reading the terrible letter. "Really?" "Really. Plus, I found the station master who was on duty that day. He keeps careful records of everyone who gets off the trains. There's no record of Blackwood arriving until the day he came looking for you." Daniel leaned forward eagerly. "Will he testify?" "He's willing to come to court and bring his logbooks. But Margaret, I have to warn you, this trial won't be easy. Blackwood's lawyer is going to try to make you look bad, maybe say terrible things about your character." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Let him try. I know who I am, and I know I didn't do anything wrong." The sheriff smiled approvingly. "That's the spirit. We're going to fight this thing and win." After the sheriff left, Margaret and Daniel spent the evening making plans for the court case. They would need to travel to Omaha, find a place to stay, and hire a lawyer of their own. It would cost money they didn't have and take them away from the farm during harvest time. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, as they sat by the fire that night. "I'm sorry I brought this trouble into your life." Daniel took her hands in his. "You didn't bring trouble. Blackwood did. And no matter what happens in that courtroom, you're my wife and I love you. Nothing can change that." Margaret felt some of her fear melt away. Whatever they faced, they would face it together. "Do you think we can win?" "I think we have something Blackwood doesn't understand," Daniel said, pulling her close. "We have the truth, and we have people who care about us. That has to count for something." Outside, the wind was picking up, bringing the first hint of winter. Margaret snuggled closer to Daniel, drawing strength from his warmth and steadiness. Tomorrow they would start preparing for the biggest fight of their lives, but tonight they had each other. The courthouse in Omaha was the biggest building Margaret had ever seen, with tall stone columns and windows that seemed to stretch up to the sky, making her feel tiny and scared as she climbed the wide steps beside Daniel on the morning of their trial. "Remember," said Mr. Fright Thompson, their lawyer, as they paused at the huge wooden doors, "answer only what you're asked. Speak clearly and tell the truth. That's all we need." Mr. Thompson was a young lawyer who had agreed to take their case for very little money because he believed in justice. He wasn't fancy like Blackwood's expensive attorney from back east, but he was honest and smart, and Margaret trusted him. Inside the courtroom, Margaret was amazed by how grand everything looked. The ceiling was painted with beautiful designs, and the judge's bench sat high above everyone else like a throne. Rows of wooden seats filled the room, and Margaret was surprised to see familiar faces in the crowd. Sheriff Morrison sat in the front row with his wife, and behind them were Dr. Anderson, Reverend Patterson, and several other people from their town. They had traveled all this way to support Daniel and Margaret, and their presence made Margaret feel stronger. On the other side of the courtroom sat Reginald Blackwood, with his expensive lawyer, and the 2 rough men who had come to the farm that day. Blackwood was dressed in his finest suit and looked confident, like he was sure he would win. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Williams," called the bailiff. Judge Williams was an older man with kind eyes and gray whiskers. He looked over the courtroom with a serious expression, then banged his wooden hammer to start the trial. "This case involves a disputed marriage contract," the judge announced. "Mr. Blackwood claims that Miss Hartwell was legally bound to marry him, and that her marriage to Mr. McKenna is therefore invalid." Blackwood's lawyer stood up first. He was a thin man, with a sharp nose, who spoke in a loud, important voice. "Your Honor, my client had a legal contract signed by Miss Hartwell and her father. When he arrived at the train station as agreed, she had already run off with another man." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with anger. That wasn't what happened at all. The lawyer called Blackwood's witnesses, starting with the scarred man from that day at the farm. The man swore he had been at the train station with Blackwood on September 15th and had seen Margaret there. "She was sitting on the platform when we arrived," the man lied smoothly. "Mr. Blackwood called out to her, but she ran away instead of greeting her intended husband." Margaret gripped Daniel's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. How could someone lie so easily in front of a judge and all these people? The second witness told the same false story, claiming they had all been at the station together. Both men sounded very sure of themselves, and Margaret worried that the judge might believe them. When it was Mr. Thompson's turn, he stood up with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, the truth is very different from what these paid witnesses claim." He called Sheriff Morrison first. The sheriff walked to the witness stand with his badge shining on his chest and his honest face serious and determined. "I was present when Mr. Blackwood came to Mr. McKenna's farm," Sheriff Morrison testified. "He made no mention of having been to the train station previously. In fact, he seemed surprised to learn that Miss Hartwell had been waiting there for 3 days. Mr. Thompson then called the station master, an elderly man who brought his official logbooks with him. "These records show every passenger who arrived at Millbrook Station in September," the station master explained. "Mr. Blackwood's name appears only once, on September 18th, not the 15th. Margaret felt hope rising in her chest. The truth was coming out at last. "Furthermore," the station master continued, "I remember Miss Hartwell very well. She waited on that platform for 3 days, growing more worried each day. No one came to meet her until she collapsed from hunger and exhaustion." Mr. Thompson called several more witnesses, including townspeople who testified about Margaret's good character and Daniel's reputation as an honest man. Each person who spoke made Margaret feel more confident that justice would win. Finally, it was Margaret's turn to testify. Her legs felt shaky as she walked to the witness stand, and she could feel everyone in the courtroom watching her. Mrs. McKenna," Mr. Thompson said gently, "please tell the court what happened at the train station." Margaret took a deep breath and began her story. She told about waiting 3 days with no word from Blackwood, about having no money for food or a place to stay, about finally collapsing from exhaustion and despair. "Mr. Blackwood was not at that station," she said clearly. "If he had been, I would have met with him as agreed. I had nowhere else to go." When Blackwood's lawyer questioned her, he tried to make her sound like a liar and a troublemaker. "Isn't it true that you wanted to break your engagement and ran away with the first man who offered?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "I honored my agreement. I waited faithfully for 3 days. Mr. Blackwood is the one who broke his promise. Why should we believe you over 3 witnesses who say otherwise?" Margaret looked directly at the judge. "Because I'm telling the truth, Your Honor, and because a real man of honor wouldn't need to pay people to lie for him." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs at her bold words, and Blackwood's face turned red with anger. When all the testimony was finished, Judge Williams announced that he would consider everything carefully before making his decision. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning." As they left the courthouse, Margaret felt exhausted but hopeful. They had told their side of the story, and she believed the truth was stronger than Blackwood's lies. "How do you think we did?" she asked Mr. Thompson. "I think," the young lawyer said with a small smile, "that justice has a very good chance of winning tomorrow." Judge Williams banged his wooden hammer 3 times, and the sound echoed through the packed courtroom like thunder, making Margaret's heart pound so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, as she waited to learn if her marriage was real or if everything she loved would be taken away. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, the judge began, his serious voice filling every corner of the room. "This court finds that the marriage contract between Miss Hartwell and Mr. Blackwood was legally broken when Mr. Blackwood failed to appear at the agreed time and place." Margaret grabbed Daniel's hand so tight she was afraid she might hurt him, but she couldn't let go. The judge's words were giving her hope. but she was too scared to celebrate yet. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, the testimony of Mr. Blackwood's witnesses contradicts the official railroad records and the sworn testimony of multiple reliable citizens. This court finds their claims to be false. A gasp went up from Blackwood's side of the courtroom. Margaret saw Blackwood lean forward and whisper angrily to his expensive lawyer, his face growing redder by the second. Therefore, the judge said firmly, the marriage between Daniel McKenna and Margaret Hartwell McKenna is declared legal and valid. Mr. Blackwood's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in cheers from Margaret's supporters. Sheriff Morrison stood up and clapped, and Mrs. Patterson wiped happy tears from her eyes. Margaret felt like she might faint from relief, but this time it was good, overwhelming feelings instead of bad ones. But Judge Williams wasn't finished yet. He banged his hammer again to restore quiet in the courtroom. However, the judge said, and Margaret's stomach dropped at that word, there is still the matter of Mr. Blackwood's claim for damages. Margaret's brief moment of joy turned to ice-cold fear. She had forgotten about the $500 Blackwood was demanding. Even if their marriage was safe, they could still be ruined by having to pay that impossible amount of money. Mr. Blackwood claims that Mrs. McKenna's actions damaged his reputation and cost him money, the judge explained. This court must consider whether any damages are owed. Mr. Thompson stood up quickly. Your Honor, if I may present additional evidence regarding Mr. Blackwood's character and business practices. You may proceed, the judge said. Mr. Thompson called a new witness that Margaret hadn't expected, a well-dressed woman about 30 years old who walked to the witness stand with confidence and determination. Please state your name for the court, Mr. Thompson said. I am Mrs. Caroline Mitchell from Kansas City, the woman replied in a clear, strong voice. Mrs. Mitchell, do you know the plaintiff, Mr. Reginald Blackwood? I do. 2 years ago, he attempted to force my younger sister into marriage using the same tactics he's using here. Margaret's eyes went wide. This was exactly what Sheriff Morrison had mentioned, but she hadn't expected the woman to actually come to court. Mrs. Mitchell told a story that sounded terrifyingly familiar. Blackwood had made a marriage contract with her sister, then failed to appear at the agreed meeting place. When the sister tried to break the engagement, Blackwood had sued for damages and threatened to ruin the family's reputation. What happened in your sister's case? Mr. Thompson asked. We fought the lawsuit and won, but it cost our family nearly everything we had in lawyer fees. Mrs. Mitchell said sadly, my sister was so upset by the whole ordeal that she became ill and took months to recover. Why did you come here to testify today? Mrs. Mitchell looked directly at Margaret with kind, understanding eyes. Because no woman should have to go through what my sister endured. Mr. Blackwood makes a business of trapping women in impossible situations, then profiting from their desperation. Blackwood's lawyer jumped up to object, but Judge Williams waved him back down. I'll allow the testimony. It goes to the character of the plaintiff. Mr. Thompson then called 2 more witnesses. 2, a banker from another town who testified that Blackwood had tried similar schemes before, and a private investigator who had discovered a pattern of Blackwood targeting women whose families owed money. Mr. Blackwood doesn't want wives, the investigator explained. He wants legal settlements. He deliberately shows up late to meetings, then sues when the women try to escape the contracts. Margaret felt sick, realizing how close she had come to being just another victim in Blackwood's cruel scheme. If Daniel hadn't found her that day, if she had tried to handle this alone, she would have been trapped just like Mrs. Mitchell's sister. Judge Williams looked at Blackwood with obvious disgust. Mr. Blackwood, in light of this testimony about your character and business practices, this court not only denies your claim for damages, but strongly warns you against pursuing similar fraudulent schemes in the future. This is outrageous, Blackwood shouted, jumping to his feet. I demand. You demand nothing in my courtroom, Judge Williams roared back, his voice echoing off the walls. Sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt. Blackwood's lawyer grabbed his client's arm and forced him back into his seat, whispering urgently in his ear. But Blackwood shook him off and stood up again. You can't do this to me, Blackwood yelled. I have rights. I have influence. I'll appeal this decision. Bailiff, Judge Williams said calmly, Please escort Mr. Blackwood from my courtroom. And if he continues to harass Mr. and Mrs. McKenna, he'll face criminal charges." As the bailiff led a still protesting Blackwood away, Margaret finally allowed herself to believe it was really over. They had won completely. Their marriage was safe. They owed no money, and Blackwood could never bother them again. Daniel pulled her into his arms right there in the courtroom, and Margaret buried her face against his shoulder and cried happy tears. All around them, their friends from home were cheering and congratulating them. "It's finished," Daniel whispered in her ear. "We're free." Sheriff Morrison came over and shook Daniel's hand firmly. Justice was served today. That man got exactly what he deserved. Mrs. Mitchell approached them with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you fought and won. My sister will be happy to hear that Blackwood finally met his match." "Thank you for coming," Margaret said gratefully. "Your testimony probably saved us." "Women need to look out for each other," Mrs. Mitchell replied. "Men like Blackwood count on us being too scared or ashamed to fight back." As they left the courthouse, Margaret felt like she was walking on clouds. The autumn sun seemed brighter, the air smelled sweeter, and everything looked beautiful. She was truly free now, free to love Daniel, free to build their life together, free to be happy without looking over her shoulder. "What should we do first when we get home?" Daniel asked, as they climbed into their wagon for the journey back to their farm. Margaret thought about their little cabin, their garden, their chickens, and all the simple pleasures of the life they had built together. "Let's just be happy," she said. "Let's go home and just be happy." 6 months after the trial, Margaret stood in the doorway of their brand new schoolhouse, watching 23 children of all ages work quietly at their lessons. And she had never felt more proud or content as she realized that her dream of teaching had finally come true in the most wonderful way possible. Mrs. McKenna called 8-year-old Sally Patterson, raising her small hand high in the air. "I've finished my arithmetic problems. May I help the little ones with their letters?" "Of course, Sally," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "You're becoming quite the teacher yourself." The schoolhouse had been built by the whole community, working together through the winter and spring. Daniel had designed it with big windows for lots of light and a small apartment in the back where they could live while teaching. Every family had contributed something: lumber, nails, paint, or just strong backs for the building work. Now children came from farms many miles around to attend school. Some stayed all week and went home on weekends, while others made the daily journey on horseback or in wagons. Margaret taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography, while Daniel helped with the older boys' lessons and taught practical skills like carpentry and farming. "Mr. McKenna," called 12-year-old Tommy Miller from the back of the room. "The baby chicks are hatching, come see." Daniel had built special boxes where they could watch chicken eggs hatch, teaching the children about life and nature. He hurried over with several excited students clustering around to see the tiny yellow chicks breaking out of their shells. Margaret watched her husband with the children and felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. Daniel was a natural teacher, patient and kind, able to explain difficult concepts in ways that made sense to young minds. The children adored him, and he seemed to come alive when he was helping them learn. "Children," Margaret announced, "it's time for lunch. Please put away your slates and gather in a circle." The students quickly cleaned up their work areas and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. Margaret had started a tradition of sharing a story during lunch, and it had become everyone's favorite part of the day. Today she chose to read from a book of fairy tales, and she watched the children's faces light up with wonder as she told the story of a brave princess who saved herself instead of waiting for a prince to rescue her. "I like that princess," said 9-year-old Emma Thompson when the story ended. "She didn't need anyone else to solve her problems." "That's right," Margaret agreed. "Sometimes we have to be brave and save ourselves, but it's also good to have people who care about us and help us when we need it." After lunch, the children played outside while Margaret and Daniel ate their own meal on the schoolhouse steps. The spring day was warm and beautiful, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and birds singing in the cottonwood trees Daniel had planted around the building. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, taking Margaret's hand as they watched the children play tag in the sunshine. Margaret considered the question seriously. A year ago, she had been a frightened young woman with no choices and no hope for the future. Now she was a respected teacher, a beloved wife, and a valued member of a caring community. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "This life is better than anything I ever dreamed of." "Even though we're not rich? Even though we work hard every day and sometimes worry about money?" Margaret laughed and squeezed his hand. "Especially because of those things. We built this life ourselves, with our own hands and our own choices. Nobody gave it to us or forced it on us. It's ours." A rider approached the schoolhouse, and Margaret recognized Dr. Anderson coming for his weekly visit. He had started checking on the children's health regularly, and he often stayed to help with afternoon lessons. "Good afternoon, Dr. Anderson," Margaret called as he dismounted. "Perfect timing for geography lessons." "Excellent," the doctor replied with a grin. "I brought my maps of South America. Who wants to learn about penguins?" Every hand in the schoolyard shot up, and the children rushed inside to see the doctor's pictures and maps. Margaret and Daniel followed, watching their students' eager faces as they learned about faraway places and amazing animals. As the afternoon wore on, parents began arriving to collect their children. Margaret enjoyed talking with the mothers and fathers, hearing about their farms and families, sharing news about their students' progress. "Margaret," said Mrs. Wilson, whose twin boys attended school, "I can't thank you and Daniel enough. Tommy and Tim have learned more in these few months than in all their previous schooling combined." "They're wonderful students," Margaret replied honestly. "Smart and curious and eager to learn." "You have a gift for teaching," Mrs. Wilson continued. "These children are lucky to have you." After the last student had gone home, Margaret and Daniel cleaned the schoolhouse and prepared lessons for the next day. Working together in the quiet building, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. "Do you remember what you told me that first day?" Margaret asked as she erased the slate boards. "About Emily wanting to start a school?" Daniel nodded, carefully putting away the geography books. "She would love seeing this. All these children learning and growing, the whole community coming together to support education." "I think about her sometimes," Margaret admitted. "I hope she knows we're carrying on her dream." "I think she knows," Daniel said softly, "and I think she's happy that we found each other." As they walked home to their cabin in the gathering twilight, Margaret reflected on the amazing journey that had brought them to this moment. The broken marriage contract that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of the most beautiful life she could imagine. "Daniel," she said as they reached their front porch, "do you think we'll always be this happy?" "I think," Daniel replied, pulling her close for a kiss, "that happiness isn't something that just happens to you. It's something you choose every day. And I choose you, and this life, and this happiness, every single day." Margaret smiled and kissed him back, surrounded by the peace and love they had built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but whatever came, they would face it together. The stars were coming out over the Nebraska prairie, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its sweet evening song. Margaret McKenna was exactly where she belonged, living the life she had chosen, surrounded by love and purpose and hope for all the tomorrows yet to come. Their story had begun with a collapse and a contract, but it had become something much more beautiful, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength found in choosing love, and the truth that sometimes the most devastating endings become the most wonderful new beginnings.